So Unit 4 is the unit on natural resources, okay? And of course, our most important one is water. So you need to know what water is used for. We assume it's used for just drinking and washing and flushing, etc. But the main thing we use water for is actually agriculture. And there's also industrial uses of water. So you need to be aware of those. You also need to be aware of what happens when you overuse the water. Things like damage to ecosystems like wetlands and things like that, as well as sinkhole formation, desertification, soil erosion, some of the many different things that are all listed here. So be familiar with that. Soil salinization, where when you overuse groundwater, well water to irrigate a field, minerals build up and the soil becomes too salty to support plant life. So be familiar with that particular thing. What we can do to conserve it. This is probably the most important part of this because it explains a lot. It has a lot to do with the water cycle, etc. So you need to, for one thing, you need to understand the concept of the watershed and water as a renewable resource. So your watershed is basically just where the water from precipitation falls around you, or in cases where it snows, the meltwater goes in the ground. Okay, so three things can happen when that happens. All right, one of the things is that the water can evaporate. So this will typically happen if it falls on a hard surface, like a road or something like that, where it can't soak down in the ground, and it'll evaporate off in the atmosphere. It also happens when you're using it in agriculture, for example, is that you spread the water out. The more you spread it out, the more it will evaporate. And when you lose water to evaporation for your watershed, that's your local water supply, it's gone from your area. It usually gets blown away, unless you're in the tropics. But otherwise, the crosswinds will take that water vapor away, and it will no longer be part of your fresh water supply. Second thing that can happen is that it can run off, can follow the ground through gravity, and settle into your low-lying areas, and those tend to be your lakes and rivers and things like that. And then that's how your water flows along, and that provides us with surface water. That's where about 50% of people in the United States get their water. And then the third thing that can happen, it's actually the ideal thing for it to happen, is for it to soak down into the ground. So when it soaks down the ground or infiltrates into the ground, then it becomes part of your aquifer that's underneath here, part of your groundwater supply, and we can also use that. About half of the country uses a groundwater supply for their drinking, the medicinal purposes, as well as their agriculture and things like that. Florida, we use about 90% of our water usage is from the ground aquifer because we have such a good supply of it. Usually only, it's almost always a better water resource than surface water because it doesn't get the contamination and things like that. So everybody clear on what an aquifer is and why it's important to maintain that and allow the processes to keep your water within your water supply? All right. This also introduces the concept of a renewable resource, and that's what fresh water is. It is a fresh water resource, of course. You've got plenty of salt water. So with fresh water, you get a certain amount that goes in. That's the renewable part of it through the precipitation of the water cycle. Then you have amounts that are used for agriculture, municipal purposes, those kind of things. And then you have your balance, how much is in there. That's going to be your supply that's in your lakes and in your groundwater. So anything that can, you can't really increase the deposit rate because we don't really have control over the rain and water cycle. But whatever you can do to reduce the withdrawals from that is going to conserve that water supply. Questions about your water resources? Okay. Then we looked at soil resources. Soil is the second most important factor in a terrestrial ecosystem after water. And it also is, of course, important for our own ecosystems that we make to feed ourselves, which we call farms. And so, particularly important there. Plants, of course, they need soil to get their minerals. It provides support for them, provides airspace for them to breathe. So it's a crucial substance for that. And the way that soil is lost is either through physical loss of wind or water erosion, or it gets demineralized, which means it loses its mineral content and that usually comes from poor farming practices, over-farming it, and it also can come from acid precipitation. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about the water pollution, air pollution, acid precipitation. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So what do we do to reduce those particular things? There's number one for water, etc. One of the things to remember about water erosion is the fact that the more water you use, the more likely you're going to have erosion. You want the perfect amount of water on your soil to soak into it and get into the plants. If you go a little bit over that, it will then break tension of the soil and it'll flow. It'll flow downhill and it'll take the soil away with it. So that's actually, besides just wasting water, that's one of the worst things about water overuse and waste of water resource is the soil erosion it causes. So you want to reduce, you want to conserve your water as described in the previous one, low flow, outlets and things, drip and mist kind of setups is best. Get the water as close to the roots as possible. And then you also want to make sure, this is another part which is in water resource conservation and irrigation, make sure things are flat as possible, because when they're flat, that reduces runoff. Runoff is a huge problem with soil erosion, and it also wastes water, basically. So you flatten your fields out as much as possible. You can also do, even if it's on a hillside, you do terracing and things, so the water will soak down to the ground and the plants can use it, and it doesn't run off and wash it away with it. When it comes to wind, one of the big things is to not till the soil. Well, this is what true wind and water erosion. But tilling the soil is when you break it up and you cut it in and ground it into the ground. And of course, it is helpful, very much so, for the plants to do that. But it leaves them exposed. So when you don't have plant material on the soil, as it's just bare dirt and everything, as you can imagine, it'll wash and blow away much easier. So they leave the crops in the ground. If they're annual crops, they just let them die naturally on their own. If they are not, then they will spray it with herbicide, and then they plant the seeds under those roots and they let it germinate and everything and grow from there. Okay. So those are many of the ways. Also, windbreaks, and we have like a wall of trees to reduce the wind and things like that. Those are all things that you can do to reduce the physical erosion of soil. And then the demineralization is some good farming techniques. Demineralization a lot of times comes from having only one crop, something we call monoculture, and it always takes the same things out of the soil, so it'll deplete these trace minerals and everything quickly. So rotate your crops, and also using things called legumes, growing things called legumes, soybeans and peanuts are examples. These types of plants actually add nitrogen back to the soil. They're called legumes, and they have these nodules of nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are in the roots. Also using organic fertilizer, composting, they break down slower and therefore not washed out of the soil as easily as others. And trying to reduce reduce acid precipitation. And also liming the soil, putting a base down to, if it's acid precipitation that's doing it, then neutralizing the soil a lot of times is something that farmers will do. They'll add lime to the soil to reduce the minerals from getting washed out. Okay? Questions about soil resources? All right. Then we had, so also, yeah, you need to know the basic composition of soil, 3 components. Sand, silt, and clay. That's from bigger to smaller. If you can visualize those, gritty sand, and then silt's kind of in between, and then clay's like a very fine, dusty substance. The relationship of these 3, this is just the size of the particles of the dirt, basically. And the relationship between these 3 things is that the larger the particles, the more aeration they have, because there's more air spaces in them, and the less they retain water. The same reason, there's more spaces, the water will soak through it. And then clay, on the other hand, being the smallest particles, does not have good aeration, don't have good air pockets. You need air in there for the roots. And retains the water, holds it back. So you need a little bit of all of that. And the ideal mixture, what we call loam, is 40-40-20 of sand, silt, and clay. So we read over here, start in the middle, read over here, directly to the left. There's details this if you want to remember how to do these. Start to the left, that's your clay, 20%. And then we can go up to the silt side, that's 40% right there. And then come back down to the sand side. Now this is the wrong thing here, yeah, it isn't. Okay, so this is 10, so this is actually 40 here, that's kind of misleading. See, because the 10 is actually here, 20 and 30. So anyway, if you go right here in the middle, that's 44-20. That's ideal mixture for a lot of agriculture, a lot of crops that are grown. It's a 40-40-20 mix. That's called loam. So you might want to, they may have a soil triangle on there, you might want to brush up on that, reading that particular thing. And those different properties for soil, sand, silt, clay. All right, then you also had your horizons or layers. O is going to be like leaf litter. The A is what we call topsoil. That will tend to have aeration and organic material in it. B is a subsoil. It's sandy and tends to have mineral content from the minerals that are soaked down through to it. And then your C, your bedrock, is just the rock that's underneath it. It's not actually part of the soil, technically. So it shows you some things, contour plowing and also strip farming to reduce water flow. If you slow the water down, that reduces erosion. So if you cut your hills and your crops like that straight across, that would reduce water erosion. And wind farms, etc. Monoculture, polyculture, etc. All right, we're going to move along here, getting a little behind. Agriculture. So this is the next section we looked at in 4. It's kind of a mixture of both water conservation, soil conservation, because those are the areas that is most important. And we have the traditional style of doing it, and the thing was with the traditional style, people before they had a lot of, you had a lot of irrigation and pesticides and chemical fertilizer. People did it the old-fashioned way. Now we know with industrialized agriculture that's come through that has changed, and on the good note in the past century, the 20th century, it's really some people believe that up to 2 billion people have been saved from starvation because of this. So that's obviously a good thing. But we also know that with the use of chemical fertilizers, use of pesticides, the type of monoculture that reduces, that decreases the soil fertility, all those things are a negative from there. So there's some level of going back the old-fashioned way. It's typically it's a lower productivity, it's labor intensive. Oftentimes, low labor in this one, use lots of machinery. Fertilizer tends to be organic stuff, food and crop waste and animal waste. Industrial, over here, chemical fertilizer. With pest control, use something called integrated pest management. And with industrial, you're looking at pesticides typically. And they plant a variety of crops. And of course, this is something just done because people fed themselves off their farms, so they didn't want to just grow one thing. And also rotating crops. People known for thousands of years how to conserve soil. That planting certain things and moving certain things, they figured out helps the soil, and therefore those traditional ways of helping soil. On the other hand, if you have industrial agriculture, rather than doing those things, which would cause a lot of expensive things, they just keep adding the chemical fertilizer to the soil, and it's not naturally replenishing itself. All right. So livestock, the big thing about livestock, about raising animals for meat, is that you get to raise 10 times as much, because the ecological pyramid, if you remember, if you're going to eat you're going to eat vegetables, you're going to, as the primary consumer, you're eating 10% of what they got. But if you eat a cow that eats the vegetables, you're eating 10% of what that cow got with 10% of, and therefore it's 10 times as much as what you need. You're only getting 1%. Because of the ecological pyramid and the efficiency of the ecological pyramid. So the fact that overgrazing can lead to soil erosion. You also have animal waste as a pollutant. We'll talk more about that. Water pollution. And then we looked at integrated pest management. This is ways of managing pest levels without using excessive amounts of pesticides, biological control, genetic engineering, genetically modified crops, and even crop rotation, things like that. So you can see many of the different parts there for that practice. And then finally, forest, fish, and mining resources. So this rounded out our different types of natural resources that we get our raw materials from. Forests, of course, we use mainly for lumber, or paper, not mainly, but for lumber, paper, Fuel, it's a big use in a lot of areas, particularly developing nations. A lot of them burn wood for their energy needs. And it is a renewable resource. Any kind of biological resource is a renewable resource. It renews itself through the process of reproduction. So make sure you understand that basic biological and resource concept. We talked about already water resources. They were renewable. Freshwater resources, they're renewable because of the hydrologic cycle brings in fresh water. I wouldn't say all the time, but at different times. And then with your biological resources like forests and fish, you have to rely upon them to reproduce, to bring back if you want more trees, you have to wait till the seedlings grow into new trees. So it is renewing. It's a lot longer process, but that's how it is a renewable resource. And lumber companies, etc., in the developed nations of the world, where we continue to harvest out of a particular forest, use techniques that allow that to happen, that allow the young trees to grow up. Harvesting the older trees allows for more sunlight and nutrients so the young trees grow up. It basically mimics the process of ecological succession. Okay, so that's the main strategy when it comes to sustainable cutting techniques, only taking out bigger trees. First of all, make sure you have a seed population, supported seed population that can grow. And second thing is that the damage of deforestation, one of the biggest ones, is the erosion that takes place. So also use different things, techniques of preserving certain trees as a wind or a wind erosion break, and to hold the soil in place so the new young trees can grow up as well, because they won't be able to grow if all the soil has been washed out or blown away. So clear cutting is the opposite of that. It's just when you just go in and take out everything. All right, so then we've got seafood is the other thing. The only major food source that we still take from the wild is our fish and other types of seafood products. This is, the main thing, once again, is to take from the population the larger organisms and reduce the amount of bycatch. Bycatch is what happens typically with nets, where you take species that you don't want. So then you impact other species that are not the ones that you want, and you have to sort them out of the nets and things like that. And then also being aware of the reproduction dynamics, taking like I said, fish of a certain size. The reason why you take only bigger fish is because they're older, and if you get them out of the ecosystem, that means the younger fish can now breed. They have more resources, more food and space to breed in, and so that helps that population. You become one of the predators of that population. It helps the population to grow and basically replenish the supply of it. So those are some ways to conserve in fishing. And then mineral resources, so stuff in the ground, the crust of the earth, these are non-renewable. These are your only non-renewable resources that we talk about are mineral resources. There's only a finite amount of them. Mining, huge impact on the environment, has complete habitat destruction, which, by the way, those you want to just put habitat destruction for these things like that, leads to soil erosion, and it leads to a loss of shelter and food for the organisms in that ecosystem. So do we hear what I'm saying here, Mr. Reeland, that just putting habitat destruction will not get you the 1.7 points that you want on each one of those tree response questions. Putting habitat destruction, which will lead to a loss of shelter for organisms and food, and also lead to soil erosion, that kind of thing. Yep. So you've got to add details if you really want to get the points on the pre-response question. So absolute habitat destruction in that case, and also the thing that happens at mines is that all of these exposed minerals, some of them are toxic like lead and cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. Keep in mind your four main toxic heavy metals. And also the fact that sulfur is almost always present in there. The sulfur gets eaten by bacteria. That produces acid byproducts, so you have what we call acid mine drainage. It's not just erosion and drainage from the mine, but it's acidic and full of metal ions, and that of course will tend to poison lakes and groundwater and other areas around it when you have mining. So mining is a very highly environmentally impactful process. Also, the raw materials then have to be processed themselves to make your different things, your aluminum cans, copper wire, those kind of things. There's a chemical and electrical processes that use a lot of different chemicals, hazardous chemicals, as well as large amounts of energy. So that's an impact as well. So it's very important, particularly with your metal resources like your aluminum cans or steel cans for food and things like that to reduce the use of them, but recycle. Recycle. That means that they don't have to mine for it, and it also uses less energy than trying to make metal from raw materials. Any questions? That is it for Unit 4.